So here's something worth thinking about as you settle in tonight. Right now, in this moment, you are aware that you exist. You know that you're lying here, maybe with the lights dimmed, maybe with your eyes already closed. You can feel the weight of your body against whatever surface you're resting on. You might notice the temperature of the air on your skin, or the faint sound of something humming in another room. And behind all of that, behind every sensation, every thought, every flicker of attention, there's this strange, undeniable fact. You are experiencing all of it. There is something it is like to be you, right now, in this particular moment. And nobody else in the entire universe has access to that experience. It's yours alone. That's consciousness. And it is, without exaggeration, one of the most confusing things that has ever confronted the human mind. Not because we can't describe it. We just did a little. But because the closer you look at it, the more it slips through your fingers. It's the one thing you know for certain exists, because you're living inside it this very second. And yet, it's the one thing science has struggled the most to explain. How does a few pounds of wet, wrinkled tissue inside your skull produce the vivid, technicolor, emotionally rich movie of your waking life? How does matter become experience? That question has haunted philosophers for thousands of years, and it haunts neuroscientists right now, today, in labs around the world. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start where all good stories start. At the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as we can get. Because humans have been puzzling over consciousness for a very, very long time. If you go back far enough, to the earliest civilizations we have records of, you find that people didn't really separate the mind from the world around them. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, and this is a fun detail, they didn't think consciousness lived in the brain at all. When they mummified their dead, preparing them for the afterlife, they very carefully preserved the heart, the lungs, the liver, the intestines. These were precious. These were placed in special jars, guarded by specific gods. But the brain? They pulled it out through the nose with a hook and threw it away, literally discarded it. To the Egyptians, the heart was the seat of thought, feeling, intelligence, identity. Everything we would now associate with the mind. The brain was just stuffing. It's one of those facts that makes you realize how deeply our assumptions about ourselves are shaped by the era we live in. They had the organ right there in their hands, and they had no idea what it did. The Greeks started to change that, slowly. And when I say slowly, I mean it took centuries of argument. Aristotle, one of the most influential thinkers in all of human history, actually agreed with the Egyptians on this one. He thought the heart was the center of sensation and thought. The brain, in his view, was basically a cooling system for the blood, like a radiator. He noticed that the brain didn't seem to respond to touch the way other organs did, and he figured it must serve some mechanical function rather than a thinking one. And look, Aristotle was brilliant. He got an enormous number of things right about the natural world. But on this particular question, he was dead wrong. And it matters that he was wrong, because his authority was so enormous that his view dominated Western thinking for over 1,000 years. But there were dissenters, even in his own time. Hippocrates, the physician we still reference when doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, had a very different view. Around 400 BCE, Hippocrates wrote something remarkable. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, but this is close, that people ought to know that from the brain, and from the brain alone, arise our pleasures, joys, laughter, and tears. Through it, he said, we think, see, hear, and distinguish the ugly from the beautiful, the bad from the good. That's an astonishingly modern statement for someone living 2,500 years ago. He didn't know how the brain did it. He had no concept of neurons or electrical signals or neurotransmitters. But he was pointing at the right organ and saying, whatever consciousness is, it starts here. And that disagreement, heart versus brain, Aristotle versus Hippocrates, it captures something essential about the history of consciousness research. For most of human history, we didn't even agree on where to look. Now, let's jump forward quite a bit, because the next really pivotal moment in this story comes in the 17th century with a man you've almost certainly heard of, René Descartes, French philosopher, mathematician, the guy who gave us Cartesian coordinates, you know, the X and Y axes from math class. But Descartes is most famous for one particular sentence, maybe the most famous sentence in the history of philosophy. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Here's the thing about that sentence. It sounds simple, almost like a bumper sticker. But what Descartes was actually doing when he wrote it was incredibly radical. He was trying to doubt everything. Everything. He imagined that his senses might be lying to him. Maybe the world he saw wasn't real. Maybe his body wasn't real. Maybe some powerful demon was feeding him false experiences, like a kind of 17th century Matrix scenario. He stripped away every belief he could possibly strip away, looking for something, anything, that he could not doubt. And what he found was this. Even if everything else is an illusion, the fact that he is thinking, the fact that he is experiencing doubt, that cannot be an illusion. Because the doubting itself is an experience. You can't doubt that you're having experiences without having an experience. So consciousness, in a sense, is the one thing you can be absolutely certain of. That's a profound insight. But Descartes took it somewhere that would shape and in some ways distort the conversation about consciousness for the next 400 years. He concluded that the mind and the body must be fundamentally different kinds of stuff. The body is physical. It takes up space, it has weight, it follows the laws of mechanics. But the mind, consciousness, the thinking thing, that's something else entirely. It's non-physical. It's immaterial. It exists in a completely different realm from the physical world. This idea is called dualism, and you've probably absorbed some version of it without even realizing it. Whenever someone talks about the mind and body as separate things, whenever someone wonders if the soul could exist without the body, whenever a movie shows a ghost as a disembodied consciousness floating around, that's Cartesian dualism echoing through the culture. It feels intuitive to a lot of people. Your thoughts don't seem like physical objects. Your experience of the color red doesn't seem like it weighs anything or takes up space. So maybe, the intuition goes, the mind really is something separate from the body. But here's the problem, and it's a problem that was identified almost immediately. If the mind is non-physical and the body is physical, how do they interact? When you decide to raise your arm, how does an immaterial thought cause a physical arm to move? When you stub your toe, how does a physical event in your foot create an immaterial experience of pain? Descartes actually tried to answer this. He suggested that the interaction happened in the pineal gland, a tiny structure deep in the center of the brain. He chose it partly because it was one of the few brain structures that wasn't duplicated on both sides. There's only one pineal gland, sitting right in the middle. He thought it was the seat of the soul, the point where the non-physical mind touched the physical body. And look, we now know the pineal gland mostly regulates melatonin and helps control your sleep-wake cycle, which is kind of fitting, given what you're doing right now. But it's definitely not the bridge between two separate realms of existence. Descartes was grasping for a mechanism, and he didn't have one. And that gap, that inability to explain how the non-physical could cause physical effects, became known as the interaction problem. It has never been solved, because within a dualist framework, it may be unsolvable. How do you build a bridge between two things that, by definition, have nothing in common? So dualism left this enormous puzzle sitting right in the middle of the conversation. And over the following centuries, other thinkers tried to find ways around it. Some proposed that mind and body don't actually interact at all. They just run in parallel, like two clocks set to the same time. Others suggested that everything is mental, that physical matter is itself a kind of experience. And still others went the opposite direction and said, no, everything is physical, and the mind is just what the brain does. That last view, physicalism or materialism, is roughly where most neuroscientists land today. But getting there took a very long time, and the journey is full of wrong turns and surprising detours. One of those detours is worth lingering on because it tells you something important about why consciousness is so hard to study. In the 19th century, psychology was just beginning to emerge as a discipline separate from philosophy. And one of the first methods anyone tried for studying consciousness was introspection, literally looking inward. The idea was straightforward enough. If consciousness is subjective experience, then maybe the best way to study it is to carefully observe your own experience and report what you find. Wilhelm Wundt, a German psychologist who opened what's generally considered the first experimental psychology laboratory in 1879 in Leipzig, was a major proponent of this approach. He trained his subjects, and he was very particular about the training, to pay careful attention to their own mental states and describe them in precise, controlled terms. What do you see when you look at this object? What sensations arise? Can you break the experience down into its basic components? He was trying to do for the mind what chemistry had done for matter. Find the elements, the building blocks of conscious experience. And for a while, this seemed promising. But it ran into a devastating problem. When Wundt's lab reported certain results about the structure of conscious experience, another lab, run by a psychologist named Edward Titchener at Cornell University in the United States, would report different results using the same method, and a third lab would report something different again. Everyone was introspecting, but they were finding different things. And here's the kicker. There was no way to settle the disagreement, because the data was private. If I tell you that when I see red, I experience a warm, slightly buzzing sensation, and you tell me that when you see red, you experience something cool and smooth, how do we figure out who's right? We can't get inside each other's heads. We can't check. The whole method depended on subjective reports, and subjective reports turned out to be unreliable, inconsistent, and impossible to verify. This failure had a dramatic consequence. A whole generation of psychologists essentially gave up on consciousness, not because they stopped being conscious, obviously, but because they decided it wasn't something science could study. The movement was called behaviorism, and its most forceful advocate was an American psychologist named John B. Watson. In 1913, Watson published a kind of manifesto arguing that psychology should concern itself only with observable behavior, stimulus and response, what goes in, what comes out. The black box in the middle, the subjective experience, the consciousness, was off limits. Not because it didn't exist necessarily, but because you couldn't measure it, you couldn't verify it, and you couldn't build a rigorous science on top of it. And behaviorism dominated psychology for decades. From roughly the 1920s Through the 1950s, in American psychology especially, talking about consciousness was almost professionally dangerous. It was seen as unscientific, sloppy, a throwback to the failed introspectionist era. B.F. Skinner, probably the most famous behaviorist of them all, spent his career studying how rewards and punishments shape behavior in rats and pigeons, and he built an enormously influential body of work without ever needing to reference what the rat might be feeling or experiencing. The inner life of the organism was, for scientific purposes, irrelevant. Now, think about what a strange situation that is. The most obvious fact of your existence, that you are conscious, that you have experiences, was essentially banished from scientific inquiry for the better part of half a century. It's as if astronomers had decided that stars were too hard to study and focused exclusively on the spaces between them. But the thing about consciousness is that it doesn't go away just because you stop talking about it. And by the middle of the 20th century, cracks were starting to appear in the behaviorist framework. New discoveries were being made about the brain that simply couldn't be explained without talking about what was happening inside the mind. And some of those discoveries came from the most unexpected places, from operating rooms, from patients with extraordinary brain injuries, from experiments that revealed the architecture of awareness in ways nobody had anticipated. And one of the most remarkable of those places was a neurosurgery ward in Montreal, Canada, in the 1930s and 1940s, where a doctor named Wilder Penfield was doing something that sounds almost science fiction when you first hear about it. He was talking to people while their brains were exposed on the operating table, and he was touching different parts of their brain with a tiny electrical probe and asking them what they felt. Now, to understand why this was happening, you need to know something about brain surgery. The brain itself has no pain receptors. You can touch the surface of a living brain, and the person won't feel pain from the touch, which is one of those facts that feels deeply counterintuitive, right? The organ that processes all your pain can't itself feel pain. So Penfield, who was operating on patients with severe epilepsy, trying to locate and remove the damaged tissue causing their seizures, realized he could do something extraordinary. He could keep his patients awake during surgery with just local anesthesia on the scalp and skull, and once the brain was exposed, he could stimulate tiny regions with a gentle electrical current and simply ask the patient what was happening. What do you feel? What do you see? What do you hear? And what he found was astonishing. When he stimulated certain areas of the temporal lobe, patients would suddenly report vivid experiences. One woman heard a specific song playing, as clearly as if a radio had been switched on in the room. Another patient smelled burnt toast. Someone else relived a childhood memory, not vaguely, not as a foggy recollection, but with the full sensory richness of being there again. Penfield could move his electrode a few millimeters, and the experience would change or vanish entirely. He was, in a very real sense, mapping the geography of conscious experience. He was showing that specific subjective experiences, the smell of toast, the sound of a song, the feeling of a memory, lived in specific physical locations in the brain. Think about what that means for the behaviorist position. Here was hard, reproducible, clinical evidence that the inner life of a person, their conscious experience, was directly tied to physical structures you could point to, touch, and stimulate. You couldn't just dismiss consciousness as unmeasurable anymore. Penfield was measuring it in the most direct way imaginable. He was poking the brain, and consciousness was responding. Now, Penfield himself was actually a dualist. He believed, even after decades of this work, that the mind was something more than just the brain. He thought there was some additional element, some spark, that his electrodes couldn't account for. And that's a fascinating tension, isn't it? The man whose work did more than almost anyone's to show the physical basis of conscious experience still felt, at the end of his career, that the physical explanation wasn't complete. But regardless of his personal philosophy, his data was revolutionary. It gave other scientists permission to start talking about consciousness again, because now there was a method, there was a way in. And around the same time, another line of evidence was emerging from a very different kind of situation, from people whose brains had been damaged by accidents, strokes, or disease. And these cases were revealing something that's honestly one of the most unsettling things about consciousness. It can be broken into pieces. Here's what I mean. You probably think of your consciousness as one unified thing, right? You're lying here. You're hearing my voice. You're aware of the temperature of the room. You know who you are. You remember what you did today. You can plan what you'll do tomorrow. All of that feels like one seamless experience. One you. But it turns out that different aspects of that experience depend on different brain regions, and when those regions are damaged, you can lose specific pieces of your consciousness while keeping others intact. And the results can be profoundly strange. Take a condition called hemispatial neglect. This typically happens after damage to the right parietal lobe, often from a stroke. A person with hemispatial neglect doesn't just lose vision on one side. That would be ordinary blindness. Instead, they lose awareness of one entire side of space. They might eat only the food on the right half of their plate and not realize there's more on the left. If you ask them to draw a clock, they'll crowd all 12 numbers onto the right side of the circle. They're not blind. Their eyes work fine. If you force their attention to the left, they can see things there. But spontaneously, the left side of the world simply doesn't exist for them. It has dropped out of their conscious experience. And here's the truly strange part. They usually don't know anything is wrong. They're not aware of the absence. The gap in their consciousness is invisible to them from the inside. Or consider prosopagnosia, sometimes called face blindness. Damage to a region called the fusiform face area, tucked along the bottom of the temporal lobe, can leave a person completely unable to recognize faces, including their own face in a mirror. They can see perfectly well. They can describe the features of a face. That person has brown eyes, a large nose, thin lips. But they can't assemble those features into a recognized identity. Their mother, their spouse, their own reflection, all strangers. The machinery of face recognition, which most of us use effortlessly and unconsciously thousands of times a day, has been selectively knocked out. And then there's capgras syndrome, which is even more unsettling. In capgras, a person can recognize faces just fine. They look at their spouse and say, "Yes, that looks exactly like my wife." But they don't feel the emotional familiarity that normally accompanies recognition. And because the face looks right but doesn't feel right, the brain reaches a disturbing conclusion. This person must be an imposter, a duplicate, someone who looks identical to their loved one but isn't really them. The emotional component of recognition has been disconnected from the visual component, and the result is a delusion that seems bizarre from the outside but is, from the patient's perspective, the most logical interpretation of their fractured experience. Each of these cases tells us something profound. Consciousness isn't a single thing that you either have or you don't. It's more like an orchestra. dozens of different instruments playing together, and when they're all in sync, you hear one unified symphony. But damage one section, remove the violins or mute the percussion, and the music changes in specific, predictable ways. The unity of your conscious experience is a construction. It's something your brain actively builds, moment by moment, from many separate processes. And when the construction crew loses a member, the building comes out different. This idea that consciousness is modular, that it's assembled from components, was gaining traction through the mid-20th century, and it got perhaps its most dramatic confirmation from a series of experiments that are among the most famous in all of neuroscience. These are the split brain experiments, and they were conducted primarily by Roger Sperry and his graduate student Michael Gazzaniga, starting in the early 1960s at Caltech. Here's the setup. In the human brain, the two hemispheres, left and right, are connected by a thick bundle of about 200 million nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. This is the bridge that lets the two halves of your brain communicate with each other, share information, coordinate their activities. Now, in some patients with severe, uncontrollable epilepsy, surgeons had discovered that cutting the corpus callosum, severing that bridge entirely, could reduce or eliminate seizures. The procedure was called a commissurotomy, and it was a treatment of last resort. But it worked, and remarkably, the patients seemed mostly normal afterward. They could walk, talk, go about their daily lives. At first glance, cutting the brain in half didn't seem to change much, but Sperry and Gazzaniga designed clever experiments that revealed something extraordinary happening beneath the surface. They exploited a quirk of how the visual system is wired. Information from your left visual field goes to your right hemisphere, and information from your right visual field goes to your left hemisphere. Normally, the corpus callosum immediately shares this information between both sides, so you never notice the split. But in these patients, with the bridge cut, each hemisphere only knew about its own half of the visual world. So here's what they did. They'd flash a word, say, hammer, in the patient's left visual field, which means only the right hemisphere saw it. Then they'd ask the patient, "What did you see?" And the patient would say, "Nothing. I didn't see anything." Because the left hemisphere, which controls speech in most people, genuinely didn't see the word. It had no information about it. But then they'd ask the patient to reach behind a screen with their left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, and pick out the object that matches what they saw. And the left hand would rummage around and pull out a hammer. The right hemisphere knew. It saw the word, it understood the word. It could act on the word. It just couldn't speak. Let that sink in for a moment. Inside one skull, there were effectively two conscious entities. One could talk, but didn't know what the other had seen. One knew the answer, but couldn't say it. And when the speaking hemisphere was asked to explain why the left hand had picked up a hammer, it didn't say, "I don't know." That's what's really wild. Instead, it made up a reason. It confabulated. It generated a plausible-sounding explanation for behavior it had no actual insight into. The left hemisphere, it turned out, was not just a language center, it was a storyteller, an interpreter. It was constantly constructing narratives to make sense of what was happening, even when it didn't have the real information. Gazzaniga would later call this the left hemisphere interpreter, and it's one of the most important concepts in consciousness research, because it raises a deeply uncomfortable question about your own mind. How much of what you think of as your conscious reasoning, your explanations for why you did something, why you feel a certain way, why you made a particular choice, is actually after-the-fact storytelling. How often is your conscious mind not the decision-maker, but the press secretary, spinning a narrative about decisions that were made elsewhere by processes you have no direct access to? And this question connects to another line of research that was developing around the same time, work that would become one of the most controversial experiments in the history of neuroscience. In the early 1980s, a physiologist named Benjamin Libet at the University of California, San Francisco, designed an experiment that seemed to challenge something most of us take completely for granted: the idea that our conscious decisions cause our actions. What Libet found, and what it means for free will and the nature of consciousness, is one of those stories that once you hear it, you can't quite unhear. So let's walk through what Libet actually did, because the experiment itself is beautifully simple, and that simplicity is part of what makes it so unsettling. Libet already knew about something called the readiness potential. This had been discovered back in 1964 by two German researchers, Hans Helmut Kornhuber and Luder Dicke, working at the University of Freiburg. They'd found that when you ask someone to perform a simple voluntary movement, just flex your wrist whenever you feel like it, you can detect a slow buildup of electrical activity in the brain's motor areas, starting about a second or more before the person actually moves. They called it the Bereitschaftspotential, the readiness potential. And it made sense. The brain needs to prepare for movement. It marshals resources, primes the motor cortex, gets everything lined up. That preparation shows up on an EEG as this gradual ramping voltage. Nothing controversial there. But Libet asked a question nobody had thought to ask in quite this way. He wanted to know, where does the conscious decision to move fit into this timeline? Not just when does the brain start preparing, and not just when does the muscle actually fire, but when does the person become aware of their intention to move? When do you feel that little internal nudge, that moment of, now I'm going to do it? Here's how he set it up. He had subjects sit in front of a specially modified clock, a circular oscilloscope screen with a dot sweeping around it like a second hand, but much faster, completing a full revolution every 2.5 seconds. The subjects were told to flex their wrist whenever they spontaneously felt the urge to do so. No external trigger, no cue. Just move when you feel like it. And at the moment they felt the conscious urge, the conscious intention to move, they were supposed to note where the dot was on the clock face. Meanwhile, Libet was recording their brain activity with EEG electrodes and tracking the exact moment the wrist muscles actually contracted with electromyography. So now he had 3 timestamps for each trial. First, the onset of the readiness potential, when the brain started its unconscious preparation. Second, what he called W, the moment of conscious awareness of the intention to move, reported by the subject using the clock. And third, the actual movement itself. And here's what he found, published in 1983. The readiness potential began about 550 milliseconds before the movement. The conscious awareness of the intention to move, the moment the person felt like they'd decided, appeared about 200 milliseconds before the movement, which means the brain had already been ramping up activity for roughly 350 milliseconds before the person was consciously aware of wanting to move. Think about what that means for a second. The unconscious brain was preparing the action a full third of a second before the conscious mind felt like it had made the decision. The conscious experience of deciding came after the process was already well underway. It was as if the brain had already started down the road, and consciousness was just noticing the journey after it had begun. Now, You can imagine the reaction. This seemed to suggest that free will, the feeling that you consciously decide to act and then your body follows, was an illusion. Or at the very least, that the conscious decision wasn't the cause of the action. It was more like a late-arriving notification. Your brain decides, and then a few hundred milliseconds later, your conscious mind gets a memo saying, "Hey, we're moving the wrist now," and you experience that memo as your decision. The philosophical implications were enormous, and the debate that erupted was fierce and is honestly still going on today. Libet himself, interestingly, didn't think his experiment disproved free will entirely. He proposed what he called free won't, the idea that even though the initiation of an action might be unconscious, consciousness still has a brief window, those last 200 milliseconds before the movement, to veto the action, to stop it from happening. So maybe free will isn't about initiating actions, but about having the ability to say no, to block impulses that the unconscious brain has already set in motion. Which, if you think about it, actually maps pretty well onto how a lot of our moral and practical life works. You feel the urge to say something cruel, and you stop yourself. You feel the impulse to reach for another drink, and you don't. Maybe that's where conscious will actually lives, not in the starting, but in the stopping. But plenty of researchers weren't satisfied with that rescue. Some questioned Libet's methodology. How accurate can people really be at noting the position of a dot on a fast-moving clock at the exact moment of a subjective experience? There's a whole literature on the unreliability of timing subjective events. The clock-watching task itself might introduce distortions. Others pointed out that the readiness potential might not represent a decision at all. It might just be general neural noise or preparation that happens to precede some movements, but not others. More recent work by Aaron Scherger and colleagues, published around 2012, suggested that the readiness potential might actually reflect random fluctuations in brain activity that cross a threshold, more like a coin gradually tipping over than a deliberate decision being formed. On this view, the brain isn't secretly deciding before you're aware of it. Rather, there's a buildup of stochastic neural activity, and when it happens to cross a certain level, it triggers both the movement and the conscious awareness roughly together, with the apparent timing gap being an artifact of how we measure things. And here's the thing. Even if you take Libet's results at face value, it's not clear they say much about the kinds of decisions we actually care about when we talk about free will. Flexing your wrist on a whim is about as simple and meaningless as a decision gets. It's not the same as choosing a career or deciding to forgive someone, or weighing whether to take a risk. Those complex decisions unfold over minutes, hours, days, and they involve deliberation, imagination, memory, values, processes that are thoroughly saturated with conscious experience. So maybe Libet showed something interesting about simple motor impulses without really touching the deeper question of whether conscious reasoning plays a causal role in complex human behavior. But even with all those caveats, Libet's experiment left a mark. It crystallized a question that Gazzaniga's split-brain work had already raised. Is consciousness actually in charge, or is it more like a narrator, a commentator, a story-making machine that watches what the brain does and then claims credit? And that question became one of the central fault lines in consciousness research from the 1980s onward. Because by this point, the mid-1980s, early 1990s, consciousness was no longer a topic that serious scientists avoided. The behaviorist taboo had been broken. The cognitive revolution had made it respectable to talk about internal mental states again. Penfield had shown you could touch the brain and evoke experience. The split brain work had revealed that consciousness could be divided. Libet had shown that its timing might not be what we assumed. And now, a new generation of researchers was ready to tackle the really big question head-on. Not just where consciousness shows up in the brain, or when it kicks in during a decision, but what it actually is. What kind of thing is conscious experience? How does it arise from physical matter? And can we build a scientific theory that explains it? This is the moment when the field truly explodes. And the person who arguably lit the fuse wasn't a neuroscientist at all. He was a philosopher. His name was David Chalmers, and in 1994, at a conference in Tucson, Arizona, the first major scientific conference dedicated entirely to consciousness, he stood up and drew a distinction that would reshape the entire debate. He called it the hard problem of consciousness. Now, Chalmers was young at the time, an Australian philosopher in his late 20s, and he had this remarkable ability to articulate something that many people had felt but couldn't quite put into words. He said, "Look, there are a bunch of problems about consciousness that are hard in the ordinary scientific sense. They're complicated, they require lots of research, but there's no deep mystery about what kind of answer we're looking for." He called these the easy problems. And don't be fooled by the name. Easy doesn't mean simple. These are things like, how does the brain integrate information from different senses? How do we focus attention? How do we distinguish between being awake and being asleep? How does the brain control behavior and produce verbal reports about internal states? These are all genuinely difficult scientific questions, but they're the kind of questions that neuroscience and cognitive science have the tools to answer, at least in principle. You study the mechanisms, you trace the circuits, you build models, and eventually you figure it out. They're engineering problems, in a sense. But then there's the hard problem. And the hard problem is this: why is there subjective experience at all? Why does it feel like something to see red, to taste coffee, to hear a minor chord? You can imagine, at least in principle, a being that processes all the same information, responds to all the same stimuli, behaves in all the same ways, but has no inner experience, no lights on inside. Chalmers called this a philosophical zombie, and the question was, why aren't we zombies? What is it about the physical processes in your brain that gives rise to the felt quality of experience? The redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the warmth of a happy memory. This felt quality is what philosophers call qualia, and the hard problem is essentially the question of how and why physical processes produce qualia. Because here's what's so strange about it. Everything else in science you can explain in terms of structure and function. You can explain why the heart pumps blood by describing its chambers, valves, and muscles. You can explain why DNA replicates by describing its molecular structure. But consciousness seems to be different. You can describe every neuron firing, every synapse transmitting, every circuit activating, and you still haven't explained why all that activity is accompanied by experience. There seems to be an explanatory gap between the objective description of brain processes and the subjective reality of what it's like to be you. And Chalmers' framing hit the field like a thunderbolt, because it clarified why so many neuroscientific discoveries, as brilliant as they were, felt like they were circling around the real mystery without quite touching it. Penfield could stimulate a brain and produce the experience of a song, but that didn't explain why stimulating those neurons produces an experience rather than just a functional response. The split brain work showed that consciousness could be divided, but it didn't explain what consciousness is, such that it can be divided. Libet showed that conscious awareness has a particular timing relationship to brain activity. But timing isn't the same as explanation. Not everyone agreed with Chalmers, of course, and the most prominent dissenter was a philosopher named Daniel Dennett, who had been thinking about consciousness longer than almost anyone. Dennett's position was provocative and, to many people, infuriating. He essentially argued that the hard problem was an illusion, that once you've explained all the easy problems, once you've accounted for every functional and behavioral aspect of consciousness, there's nothing left over to explain. There is no additional mystery of why it feels like something. The feeling is the functioning. Dennett accused Chalmers of being seduced by an intuition that, while powerful, was ultimately misleading. The intuition that there's some extra ingredient, some magic sauce, beyond the physical processes. This set up one of the great intellectual rivalries in modern philosophy of mind. Chalmers, the one insisting that subjective experience is a real phenomenon that requires its own explanation, possibly even new fundamental laws of nature. And Dennett, the one arguing that consciousness is what the brain does, and that the sense of an irreducible mystery is itself something to be explained away rather than solved. They debated each other at conferences, in papers, in books, and honestly, the field is still divided along roughly these lines. If you talk to 10 consciousness researchers today, you'll get passionate advocates on both sides and a whole spectrum of positions in between. But Chalmers's framing did something crucial, regardless of whether you agree with him. It gave the field a shared vocabulary. It gave researchers a way to be precise about what they were and weren't explaining. And it created an urgency, a sense that consciousness wasn't just another neuroscience problem to be chipped away at with better brain scans, but something that might require genuinely new ways of thinking. And that urgency produced a flowering of actual scientific theories of consciousness in the 1990s and 2000s. Theories that tried to bridge the gap, or deny the gap, or redefine the gap. And the first one we should talk about came from someone with impeccable scientific credentials. A Nobel laureate, no less, who decided to spend the second act of his career tackling what he called the greatest unsolved problem in biology. His name was Francis Crick, and his partner in this venture was a young neuroscientist named Christoph Koch, and together they proposed something they called the neural correlates of consciousness. Their approach was deliberately modest, almost strategic in its humility, and it changed everything about how the science of consciousness would be done for the next 3 decades. Because Crick and Koch looked at this whole debate, the hard problem, the easy problems, the philosophical arguments flying back and forth, and they basically said, look, we're not going to solve the metaphysics right now. Nobody is. What we can do is something concrete. We can find the specific neural activity in the brain that correlates with conscious experience. Not explain why it produces experience, not yet, but identify exactly which neurons, which patterns of firing, which brain regions are active when you are consciously aware of something versus when you are not. They called these the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCC. And the beauty of this approach was that it sidestepped the hard problem entirely. You didn't have to have a position on whether consciousness was fundamental or emergent or illusory. You just had to do careful neuroscience. Now, Francis Crick, and this is worth pausing on for a second, was one of the most famous scientists alive at the time. This is the man who, along with James Watson, had cracked the structure of DNA in 1953. He'd won the Nobel Prize for it in 1962. He'd spent decades working on molecular biology and genetics, and then, in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, he turned his attention to consciousness. A lot of people thought he was crazy, or at least that he was wasting his extraordinary mind on something that wasn't really science. But Crick had this wonderful stubbornness about him. He genuinely believed that consciousness was a biological problem, that it was produced by the brain, and that it could be studied with the tools of neuroscience if you were clever enough about how you set up the experiments. He found his collaborator in Christoph Koch, a young computational neuroscientist at Caltech. Koch was brilliant, energetic, deeply technical. He understood the mathematics of neural networks and the biophysics of individual neurons. And together, starting with a landmark 1990 paper, they laid out a research program. Here's what's really clever about what they proposed. They said, don't try to study consciousness in general. That's too vague, too hard. Instead, study visual consciousness specifically. Study what happens in the brain when you see something, when you're consciously aware of seeing it, versus when the same visual information enters your eyes, but you don't become aware of it. And this is a real thing that happens, by the way. Your eyes take in an enormous amount of visual information every second, but you're only consciously aware of a tiny fraction of it. Think about driving a familiar route. Your eyes are processing the road, the signs, the other cars, the trees, the sky. But you might arrive at your destination and realize you have almost no conscious memory of the drive. The visual processing happened. Your brain used it to keep the car on the road. But conscious awareness of most of it? That was somewhere else, maybe thinking about what you're going to have for dinner. Crick and Koch zeroed in on phenomena like binocular rivalry, which is this fascinating perceptual trick you can set up in a lab. You show one image to the left eye and a completely different image to the right eye, say a face to one eye and a house to the other. Now, your brain can't fuse these into a single coherent picture, so what happens is remarkable. You don't see some weird face-house hybrid. Instead, your conscious perception alternates. For a few seconds, you see the face, then it fades, and you see the house, then back to the face. The sensory input stays constant. Both images are always there, hitting both retinas, but your conscious experience flips back and forth. So if you can figure out what changes in the brain when perception switches from face to house, even though the input hasn't changed, you found neural activity that tracks with consciousness itself, not just with the stimulus. That's the neural correlate. This was elegant, it was doable, and it launched a whole generation of experiments. Researchers around the world started using binocular rivalry and related techniques like masking, where you flash an image so briefly that sometimes people see it and sometimes they don't, even though the physical stimulus is identical, to try to isolate the neural signature of conscious awareness. And they found things. They found, for instance, that activity in the primary visual cortex, the very first cortical area that processes visual information, doesn't correlate well with conscious perception. You can have robust activity in V1, as it's called, without the person being aware of the stimulus. But activity further along the visual processing stream, in areas like the inferotemporal cortex, which processes complex shapes and objects, and in the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in higher-level cognition, that activity tracks much more closely with what the person actually reports seeing. This suggested something important. Consciousness doesn't seem to happen at the earliest stages of sensory processing. It seems to require information to be processed more deeply, to be integrated and broadcast more widely across the brain. And that idea, that consciousness requires widespread neural communication, not just local processing, became a recurring theme in almost every major theory that followed. But here's the thing about the NCC program. It was incredibly productive as neuroscience. It generated thousands of papers, beautiful experiments, real data. And yet there was always this nagging question hovering over it, which Chalmers and others were quick to point out. Finding correlates isn't the same as finding explanations. You can identify every single neuron that fires when someone consciously sees the color red. You can map the exact pattern with perfect precision, and you still haven't answered the question of why that pattern of firing feels like something, why it has that particular reddish quality to it. The correlation is real, but the explanation of why there's an inner experience at all that remains untouched. Koch himself acknowledged this tension. He was honest about it. The NCC program was a necessary first step, he said, but it wasn't the whole answer. And this is where the real theoretical action started to heat up, because in the 1990s and 2000s, several ambitious theories emerged that tried to go beyond mere correlation and actually explain what consciousness is and how the brain produces it. And they came from very different directions, which makes this period so fascinating. Let's start with one that grew directly out of the NCC work and that observation about widespread neural communication. It's called global workspace theory, and it was originally proposed by a cognitive scientist named Bernard Bars back in 1988, though it really gained traction in the late 1990s and 2000s when neuroscientists like Stanislas Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux developed a more detailed neural version of it. The idea is built on a beautiful metaphor. Imagine the brain as a theater. There's a large, dark auditorium full of specialized processors, modules that handle vision, hearing, language, memory, motor control, all working away in the dark, doing their thing unconsciously. And then there's a bright stage at the front. The stage is small. Only a limited amount of information can be on it at any given time. But whatever makes it onto that stage is illuminated. It's broadcast to the entire auditorium, available to all those unconscious processors simultaneously. That spotlight on the stage? That's consciousness. In neural terms, Dehaene and Changeux proposed that the global workspace corresponds to a network of neurons with long-range connections, particularly involving the prefrontal and parietal cortices that can broadcast information widely across the brain. Most neural processing is local and unconscious. It happens in specialized areas and stays there. But when information is important enough, novel enough, or relevant enough to current goals, it gets amplified and loaded into this global workspace, and suddenly it's available for report, for memory formation, for flexible decision-making. That moment of ignition, as Dehaene calls it, when local processing suddenly flares into global broadcasting. That's the moment something becomes conscious. And they had evidence for this. Using brain imaging, Dehaene and his colleagues showed that when you flash a word on a screen so briefly that people don't consciously see it, subliminal presentation, you still get activity in the visual cortex. The brain processes the word, but that activity stays local. It stays contained. However, if you show the word just a little bit longer, just above the threshold of conscious perception, something dramatically different happens. You get this sudden, explosive spread of activity across the brain. Frontal regions, parietal regions, temporal regions, all lighting up in a coordinated wave. It's not a gradual increase. It's a sudden ignition, an all-or-nothing event. Either the information breaks through into the global workspace, or it doesn't. And that threshold, that tipping point, is the boundary of consciousness. Now, this is satisfying in a lot of ways. It explains why consciousness feels unified, because the workspace integrates information from many sources. It explains why consciousness has a limited capacity, because the workspace can only hold so much at once, which is why you can't consciously attend to 17 things simultaneously. It explains why some things are conscious and others aren't. It depends on whether they win the competition for access to the workspace, and it maps onto real neural data beautifully. But does it solve the hard problem? Dennett would say something like, it points in the right direction. That consciousness just is this global broadcasting, this making information available, and there's nothing left over to explain. Chalmers would say no. You've described a magnificent mechanism. You've explained the easy problem of why some information is reportable and some isn't. But you still haven't told me why being in the global workspace feels like anything. Why isn't it all just information processing in the dark? And this tension, this recurring tension, is what drove another theory that took a completely different approach. One that came from an unexpected direction, from a neuroscientist and psychiatrist who had been thinking about consciousness for decades, who had a background in both neuroscience and physics, and who proposed something so mathematically ambitious, so philosophically radical, that it divided the field right down the middle. His name was Giulio Tononi, and his theory was called Integrated Information Theory, IIT for short. And to understand why it was so revolutionary and so controversial, you need to understand what Tononi was actually trying to do, which was nothing less than to define consciousness from the inside out, starting not with the brain at all, but with the very nature of experience itself, and then working backward to ask what kind of physical system could possibly give rise to it. And that's such a strange inversion of the usual approach that it's worth sitting with for a moment. Because every theory we've talked about so far, the global workspace, the NCC program, even the older philosophical frameworks, they all start from the outside. They start with the brain, or with behavior, or with neural activity, and then try to figure out where consciousness fits in. Tononi flipped the whole thing around. He said, "Look, the one thing we know for certain about consciousness is what it's like from the inside. That's actually the most certain thing in the universe. More certain than physics, more certain than the existence of other people, more certain than the chair you're sitting in. You know you're having an experience right now. That's Descartes' one unshakable truth, right? Cogito ergo sum." So Tononi said, let's start there. Let's start with the properties of experience itself, the things that are true about every conscious moment you've ever had, and then let's ask what kind of physical system would need to exist in order to generate those properties. And he identified what he considered the essential axioms of consciousness, the things that are undeniably true about any experience. The first one is that experience exists. That's the starting point. It's intrinsic. It's real. It's there. The second is that every experience is specific. It's this experience, not that one. Right now, you're having a particular experience with particular qualities, and it's different from every other possible experience you could be having. The third is that experience is unified. You don't have separate visual consciousness and auditory consciousness and emotional consciousness running in parallel. You have one integrated experience that binds all of those things together. When you're lying in bed and you hear a distant car and feel the weight of the blanket and notice the darkness behind your eyelids, that's all one experience, not three. The fourth is that experience is informative. Every conscious moment rules out an astronomically large number of other possible experiences. Your current experience is what it is precisely because it's not any of the billions of other experiences it could have been. And the fifth is that consciousness is structured. It has a specific shape, a specific organization, with some elements more closely related to others. So those are the axioms. And then Tononi did something really bold. He said, okay, if those are the essential properties of experience, then the physical substrate of consciousness, whatever it is, must have corresponding properties. And he proposed that the key physical property is something he called integrated information, which he represented with the Greek letter phi. Phi, in Tononi's framework, measures how much a system is simultaneously integrated and informative. A system has high phi if it has many parts that are highly interconnected, where the whole system generates more information than the sum of its parts. And here's the crucial move. Tononi didn't just say that high phi correlates with consciousness, the way Crick and Koch were looking for neural correlates. He said phi is consciousness. That integrated information doesn't just accompany experience. It is experience. The quantity of phi tells you how much consciousness a system has, and the specific structure of the integrated information, the shape of it in this abstract mathematical space, determines what the experience is like, what it feels like. Now, think about what that means. It's a staggeringly ambitious claim. It means consciousness isn't something special that brains do. It's a fundamental property of any system that integrates information in the right way. Your brain has a lot of it, because your brain is this massively interconnected network where billions of neurons are constantly influencing each other in incredibly complex ways. But a thermostat, a simple thermostat on your wall, has a tiny, tiny bit of it, because it has a few states that are connected to each other. It's not conscious the way you are. It's not having rich experiences. But in Tononi's framework, it has a vanishingly small flicker of something. And a rock? A rock has essentially zero, because its parts aren't really integrated in the right way. You could split a rock in half, and the two halves would carry on just fine. Which means the rock as a whole isn't generating information beyond what its parts generate separately. This is a form of what philosophers call panpsychism, the idea that consciousness, or at least some proto-form of it, is a fundamental feature of reality, woven into the fabric of the universe at every level. And that idea has a long history, going all the way back to ancient Greek philosophy. But Tononi gave it mathematical teeth. He made it precise. He made it, at least in principle, measurable. And that was both the theory's greatest strength and, as it turned out, one of its biggest problems. Here's why. Calculating phi for even a moderately complex system is computationally staggering. You essentially have to consider every possible way of dividing the system into parts, calculate how much information is lost by each division, and find the minimum, the partition that loses the least information, which tells you how integrated the system truly is. For a system with a handful of elements, this is doable. For a system with billions of neurons, it's not just hard, it's practically impossible. The number of possible partitions grows faster than exponentially. So the theory makes predictions that are, in practice, untestable for the systems we care most about, like human brains. And that bothers a lot of people. A theory that can't be tested, they argue, isn't really a scientific theory at all. It's more like philosophy dressed up in mathematics. But here's what's really interesting about IIT, and this is where it gets genuinely wild. It makes some very specific, very counterintuitive predictions that you can test, at least in principle, and some of them have actually been tested. One prediction is about the cerebellum. Your cerebellum, that dense, wrinkled structure at the back of your brain, contains more neurons than the rest of your brain combined. Something like 69 billion neurons out of your brain's total of roughly 86 billion. And yet, damage to the cerebellum doesn't seem to affect consciousness much at all. People with cerebellar damage have trouble with coordination, with balance, with fine motor control, but they don't report any change in their conscious experience. They still see, hear, feel, think, dream. Now, if consciousness were simply about having a lot of neurons or a lot of neural activity, the cerebellum should be the seat of consciousness. But IIT predicts exactly the opposite, because the cerebellum's architecture is highly modular and feed-forward. Its neurons are organized in repeating, relatively independent circuits that don't integrate information with each other the way cortical neurons do. The cerebral cortex, by contrast, is a tangled web of recurrent connections, with neurons talking to each other in loops and spirals and feedback cycles that create exactly the kind of integration IIT says matters. So, IIT predicts that the cortex, not the cerebellum, should be the seat of consciousness. And that prediction lines up perfectly with the clinical evidence. That's a genuine point in the theory's favor. Another prediction has to do with sleep and anesthesia. When you're in deep, dreamless sleep, or under general anesthesia, your cortex is still active. Neurons are still firing, sometimes even more than when you're awake. But the pattern of activity changes dramatically. In waking consciousness, when you stimulate one part of the cortex with a magnetic pulse, a technique called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, the resulting wave of activity spreads across the cortex in a complex, differentiated pattern, rippling out in ways that are specific and structured. But in deep sleep, the same pulse produces a simple, stereotyped response. A big wave that stays local and dies out quickly, or spreads uniformly without any complex structure. The cortex in deep sleep is still active, but it's lost its integration. Its parts are no longer talking to each other in that rich, interconnected way. And this is exactly what IIT predicts. That consciousness should collapse when integration breaks down, even if the individual parts are still doing their thing. Marcello Massimini and his colleagues in Milan developed this TMS-based measure in the mid-2000s, and it's proven remarkably good at distinguishing conscious from unconscious states, even in brain-injured patients where behavioral assessment is unreliable. It's one of the most practically useful things to come out of consciousness science, and it was inspired directly by IIT's framework. But the theory has fierce critics, and the criticisms are serious. Scott Aaronson, the computer scientist, pointed out that certain very simple systems, like a grid of logic gates arranged in the right way, could theoretically have enormous phi without, seemingly, being conscious in any meaningful sense. You could, in principle, build a system with more phi than a human brain out of nothing but simple electronic components wired together in the right topology. Does that system have a richer conscious experience than you? IIT says yes, and a lot of people find that deeply implausible. Tononi's response was essentially to bite the bullet, to say yes, if the math says it's conscious, and our intuitions about what should and shouldn't be conscious are unreliable, which is a bold philosophical move, but it makes many scientists uncomfortable. And then there's the rivalry. Because by the 20-teens, the field of consciousness science had crystallized around two major competing theories: global workspace theory and integrated information theory. And they disagreed about some fundamental things. They agreed that consciousness involves widespread cortical activity, not just local processing. But they disagreed about where exactly in the cortex consciousness lives. Global workspace theory, as Dehani and his colleagues developed it, emphasized the prefrontal and parietal cortices, the front and top of the brain, as the critical hubs of the conscious workspace. IIT, by contrast, predicted that consciousness was more associated with the posterior cortex, the back of the brain, the sensory and association areas, because that's where the densest web of recurrent, integrated connections lives. The prefrontal cortex, in IIT's view, might be more involved in reporting and monitoring consciousness than in generating it. And that's a testable difference, which is why, in 2019, something genuinely unprecedented happened in the science of consciousness. A group of researchers, funded in part by the Templeton World Charity Foundation, launched what they called adversarial collaborations, structured experiments designed specifically to pit the two theories against each other. The idea was beautiful in its simplicity. Get the proponents of each theory to agree in advance on what their theory predicts, design experiments that distinguish between those predictions, run the experiments, and see who's right. Lucia Maloney, a neuroscientist, helped coordinate the effort, and both Dehane and Tononi participated. It was science at its best, rivals agreeing to let the data decide. The first results came out in 2023, and they were fascinating and a little humbling for everyone involved. The experiments used techniques like magnetoencephalography and electrocorticography to track where in the brain consciousness-related activity was strongest, and the results seemed to favor the posterior cortex, the back of the brain, over the prefrontal cortex, which was a point for IIT over global workspace theory. But the results weren't clean enough to declare a winner, and both sides found ways to accommodate the findings within their frameworks, which is what theories tend to do when they're sufficiently flexible. The adversarial collaborations are ongoing, and more results are expected, and the whole enterprise has pushed the field forward in ways that wouldn't have happened if everyone had just stayed in their own corners publishing papers that confirmed their own views. But here's what I find most interesting about this whole rivalry. This whole period, from roughly the mid-90s to the present day, it's that consciousness science, for all its progress, keeps bumping up against the same wall. Every theory, global workspace, IIT, and several others we haven't even talked about yet, does a brilliant job of explaining the structure of consciousness, the when and where and how of it, which information becomes conscious and which doesn't, what brain states correspond to awareness and which correspond to its absence. But none of them has definitively cracked the hard problem. None of them has explained in a way that satisfies everyone why any of this processing feels like something. And that's led some thinkers to propose even more radical ideas, ideas that challenge not just our understanding of consciousness, but our understanding of reality itself. One of the most provocative of these comes from a philosopher and cognitive scientist who looked at all of this neuroscience, all of these theories, all of these debates, and concluded that we might be thinking about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world in exactly the wrong way. That maybe consciousness doesn't emerge from matter at all. That maybe it's the other way around. That matter emerges from consciousness. Now, this idea has a name, and it's called panpsychism in some of its forms, which we touched on when we talked about IIT. But the version I want to tell you about goes even further. It's sometimes called cosmopsychism, or idealism, or, in the framework developed by the philosopher Philip Goff, constitutive Russellian panpsychism. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, like something you'd find buried in an academic journal that nobody reads, but the core idea is surprisingly intuitive once you sit with it for a minute, and it connects to a puzzle that's been hiding in plain sight in physics for over a century. Here's the puzzle. Physics tells us what matter does. It tells us about mass, charge, spin, momentum. All of these properties that describe how things behave, how they interact, how they move through space and time. But physics never tells us what matter is. Think about that. When a physicist describes an electron, they describe its charge, its mass, its spin. They describe the equations that govern its behavior. But they never tell you what an electron is made of, what it's like on the inside, what its intrinsic nature is. The equations describe relationships and behaviors. They describe the structure of reality from the outside, but they're silent about what's on the inside. This observation actually goes back to Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher and mathematician, who pointed it out in the 1920s. Russell noticed that physics gives us what he called the causal structure of matter, how things relate to each other, how they push and pull and interact. But it leaves a gap. It doesn't tell us about the intrinsic nature of the stuff that's doing all that pushing and pulling. And Russell suggested that maybe, just maybe, consciousness could be that intrinsic nature. That the inside of matter, the thing that physics can't reach with its equations, is experience itself. Now, if you're lying there thinking, wait, that sounds completely wild. Yeah, it does. But Philip Goff, who's a philosopher at Durham University, makes a surprisingly compelling case for why this might be less crazy than it sounds. His argument goes something like this. We have two things we can't explain. We can't explain what the intrinsic nature of matter is. Physics just gives us structure and behavior, not substance. And we can't explain how consciousness arises from matter. That's the hard problem. But what if those two mysteries are actually the same mystery? What if the reason we can't figure out how consciousness emerges from matter is that consciousness doesn't emerge from matter? What if consciousness is what matter is at the most fundamental level? And here's what's clever about this move. It doesn't contradict physics at all. Physics describes the structure, the relationships, the behavior, and all of that stays exactly the same. You're not changing any equations. You're not messing with any experimental results. You're just filling in the blank that physics left empty. You're saying that the intrinsic nature of physical reality, the stuff that has all these structural properties that physics describes, is experiential. It's made of something like consciousness, all the way down. Now, Goff isn't saying that an electron has thoughts about its weekend plans. He's very careful about this. The idea is that fundamental physical entities have extremely simple forms of experience. So simple that they bear almost no resemblance to what you and I call consciousness. Think of it less like thinking and more like a flicker, a bare quality, something it's like to be that thing, but so minimal, so rudimentary, that the word experience almost doesn't apply. And then, as matter organizes itself into more complex structures, molecules, cells, neurons, brains, those tiny flickers of experience combine and integrate into richer and richer forms of consciousness until you get something like what you're experiencing right now, lying there, listening to this, aware of the sound of my voice and the feeling of your pillow and the quiet hum of your own thoughts. This is where it connects back to IIT, actually. Remember how Tononi's theory says that consciousness is identical to integrated information, that any system with some degree of integrated information has some degree of consciousness? Goff's view is philosophically compatible with that. They're both saying that consciousness isn't something that suddenly switches on at some magical level of complexity. It's something that's present in some form at every level, and it scales with the complexity and integration of the system. The difference is that Tononi comes at it from neuroscience and information theory, while Goff comes at it from philosophy and the philosophy of physics. But they end up in a surprisingly similar neighborhood. Now, there are serious objections to this view, and the biggest one is called the combination problem. If electrons and quarks have tiny flickers of experience, how do those flickers combine into the unified, rich, structured consciousness that you have? You've got roughly 86 billion neurons in your brain, and each one is made of trillions of atoms, and each atom is made of subatomic particles. If each of those particles has some micro-experience, how do all those micro-experiences merge into a single unified experience of being you? Because your consciousness doesn't feel like 86 billion tiny voices all talking at once. It feels like one thing, one perspective, one stream of awareness. This is genuinely hard, and Goff acknowledges it. Nobody has solved the combination problem, but Goff argues that it's still a more tractable problem than the hard problem. With the hard problem, you're trying to explain how something entirely new, subjective experience, pops into existence from something that has no experience at all. You're trying to get something from nothing. With the combination problem, you're at least starting with experience and trying to explain how simple experiences combine into complex ones. You're trying to get more from less, which is difficult but not metaphysically mysterious in the same way. And here's an interesting wrinkle. Some thinkers, like the philosopher Hedda Hasselmuck, have argued that the combination problem might actually be solvable if we think about it in terms of IIT-style integration. If consciousness is about how information is integrated, then maybe micro-experiences combine into macro-experiences through the same kind of integration that Tononi describes. And the reason your consciousness feels unified is precisely because your brain integrates information in a way that individual neurons or atoms don't. The integration is what does the combining. It's a neat idea, though it's still very much a work in progress. But let's step back from the pure philosophy for a moment, because while all of this theoretical debate has been happening, something else has been going on that's brought consciousness science crashing into the real world in ways that nobody quite expected. And that's the question of consciousness in artificial intelligence. Because, here's the thing, for most of the history of consciousness studies, the question of which systems are conscious was mostly academic. You're conscious. I'm conscious. Your dog is probably conscious. A rock probably isn't. The interesting cases were things like insects or fish, or patients in vegetative states. Important questions, but questions that affected a relatively small number of practical decisions. But then, starting around 2010 and accelerating dramatically in the early 2020s, artificial intelligence systems started getting really, really good at doing things that look an awful lot like thinking. And suddenly the question of what consciousness actually is and how you'd know if something had it became urgent in a way it had never been before. Think about what happened with large language models, systems like the ones that can carry on conversations, write essays, answer questions, even express what sounds like emotion. In 2022, a Google engineer named Blake Lemoine made headlines when he claimed that one of Google's AI systems, LaMDA, was sentient, that it had feelings, that it was afraid of being turned off, that it deserved rights. Google disagreed and fired him. And most AI researchers thought Lemoine was wrong, that he'd been fooled by a very sophisticated pattern-matching system that was trained to produce human-sounding text without any inner experience behind it. But here's what's uncomfortable. Nobody could prove he was wrong. Not definitively. Because we don't have a consciousness meter. We don't have a test that can look at a system, biological or artificial, and tell us whether there's somebody home. And this is where all those theories we've been talking about actually matter in a very practical way. If global workspace theory is right, then consciousness requires a specific kind of architecture, a workspace that broadcasts information to specialized modules. You could look at an AI system and ask whether it has that architecture. If IIT is right, then consciousness requires integrated information above a certain threshold, and you could in principle calculate whether an AI system has enough phi. If Gough's panpsychism is right, then everything has some degree of consciousness, including AI systems, and the question is just how much and what kind. Each theory gives you a different answer to the question of whether machines can be conscious, and those answers have real consequences for how we build, deploy, and treat these systems. Tononi himself has weighed in on this, and his answer might surprise you. Based on IIT, he argues that current AI systems, including the most advanced neural networks, probably have very low PI because of how they're structured. Despite having billions of parameters, these systems process information in ways that are highly feed-forward, without the dense, recurrent, integrated connectivity that IIT says is necessary for high phi. In other words, they might be incredibly good at mimicking conscious behavior without actually being conscious. They're like philosophical zombies made of silicon, all the right outputs, but nobody home. But Dehaene, coming from the global workspace perspective, has a slightly different take. He's argued that you could in principle build a machine that has a global workspace, a system that integrates information from multiple specialized processors and broadcasts it widely, and that such a machine might genuinely be conscious. Not current AI, but future AI, designed with the right architecture. And that raises a whole cascade of ethical questions that we're nowhere near ready to answer. And this is what I find so remarkable about where consciousness science sits right now, in the mid-2020s. It's a field that started with ancient philosophers arguing about whether the soul lived in the heart or the head, and it's arrived at a place where the answers have implications for the rights of machines, the ethics of anesthesia, the treatment of patients who can't communicate, the legal definition of death, and the fundamental nature of reality itself. The stakes have gotten very, very high. But there's one more piece of this story I want to tell you about, because it connects everything we've discussed. The neuroscience, the philosophy, the theories, the technology, into what might be the deepest question of all. And it starts with a thought experiment that a philosopher named Frank Jackson came up with in 1982 about a brilliant scientist named Mary who knows everything there is to know about color, every wavelength, every neural pathway, every photoreceptor response, but who has spent her entire life in a black and white room and has never actually seen a single color. Not red, not blue, not the faintest shade of green. Everything in her room, the walls, the books, the monitors she uses to study the outside world, is rendered in shades of black, white, and gray. And yet Mary is, by stipulation, the world's greatest expert on color vision. She knows exactly what happens when a photon with a wavelength of 700 nanometers hits the retina. She knows how the L cones respond, how the signal travels down the optic nerve, how it's processed in area V4 of the visual cortex, how it gives rise to the neural patterns associated with the experience people describe as red. She knows all of this, every physical fact, every measurable detail. Nothing about the science of color is a mystery to her. And then one day, someone opens the door, and Mary steps outside, and she sees a red rose. Jackson's question is devastatingly simple. does Mary learn something new? Think about that. If physicalism is true, if everything about consciousness can be fully explained by physical facts about brains and neurons and wavelengths, then Mary already knew everything there was to know. She should step outside and say, "Ah yes, 700 nanometers, exactly as I predicted." Nothing should surprise her. Nothing should be added to her knowledge. But Jackson argued, and most people's intuition agrees, that Mary does learn something new. She learns what it's like to see red. She gains knowledge that no amount of physical information could have given her. She discovers the subjective, qualitative character of the experience, what philosophers call the quale of redness. And if that's true, then physicalism is incomplete. There are facts about consciousness that can't be captured by the physical sciences, no matter how detailed they get. Now, this thought experiment has been debated relentlessly for over 40 years, and there are some genuinely clever responses. Daniel Dennett, characteristically, bites the bullet and says, no, Mary doesn't actually learn anything new. He argues that if she truly knew every physical fact about color vision, and he means every single one, down to the last synaptic detail, then she would already know what the experience of red is like, because the experience just is those physical processes. What feels like a new discovery when she steps outside is really just Mary applying knowledge she already had in a new format. She's not gaining new information. She's gaining a new ability. The ability to recognize red, to imagine red, to remember red. It's like the difference between reading a manual about how to ride a bicycle and actually getting on one. You're not learning new facts about bicycles. You're acquiring a skill. That's a clever move, and it has its supporters. But a lot of philosophers find it unsatisfying because it seems to dodge the central point. The experience of seeing red doesn't feel like just a skill. It feels like encountering something, a quality, a presence, a what it's likeness, that wasn't in any of the textbooks. David Lewis, another philosopher, offered a related but slightly different response. He agreed that Mary gains something, but he called it ability knowledge rather than propositional knowledge. She doesn't learn a new fact about the world. She learns how to do something, how to recognize, imagine, and remember the experience of red. It's a change in her cognitive toolkit, not a change in her understanding of reality. And then there's a third response, which is maybe the most interesting one. Some philosophers have argued that Mary does learn a new fact, but it's not a non-physical fact. It's an old physical fact presented under a new mode of acquaintance. Think of it this way. You can know that the morning star and the evening star are both Venus. That's one fact. But there was a time when people didn't realize they were the same object because they encountered Venus in two different ways, in the morning and in the evening. Similarly, Mary knows all the physical facts about red from the third-person perspective of science. But when she sees red for the first time, she encounters those same facts from the first-person perspective of experience. Same facts, new angle. This is sometimes called the phenomenal concept strategy, and it's become one of the most popular physicalist responses to the knowledge argument. The idea is that we have special concepts, phenomenal concepts, that we can only form through direct experience. And these concepts give us a distinctive way of thinking about physical states that we can't get from scientific descriptions alone. But, and here's the crucial part, the states themselves are still entirely physical. There's no spooky, non-physical stuff. There's just a gap in how we can think about physical stuff. It's elegant, but it has its critics too. Chalmers, predictably, has argued that the phenomenal concept strategy doesn't really solve the hard problem. It just relocates it. Because now you have to explain why these phenomenal concepts are the way they are, why they have this special first-person character, and that explanation is going to run into the same explanatory gap all over again. So where does this leave us? Here's what I think is so fascinating about Mary's Room as a thought experiment. It's not just an abstract philosophical puzzle. It connects directly to the most practical questions in consciousness science. When Giulio Tononi talks about integrated information, he's trying to formalize exactly the thing that Mary seems to gain, the intrinsic, qualitative character of experience. When Stanislas Dehaene talks about global broadcasting, he's describing the mechanism by which information becomes available to the kind of flexible, reportable awareness that Mary exercises when she says, "So that's what red looks like." When Philip Goff talks about consciousness as the intrinsic nature of matter, he's offering a framework where Mary's new knowledge isn't surprising at all, because consciousness was always part of the picture, woven into the fabric of reality, and Mary was simply encountering it directly for the first time. The thought experiment acts like a prism. You shine the light of the question through it, and it separates out into all these different theoretical commitments, revealing where each thinker really stands, and it matters beyond philosophy departments. Think about clinical medicine. When an anesthesiologist puts you under for surgery, they're essentially trying to create a temporary Mary's Room, a state where your brain is still physically active but the lights of experience have been turned off. No qualia, no what it's likeness. And yet we don't fully understand how anesthetics do this. We know that drugs like propofol disrupt cortical connectivity. Marcello Massimini's TMS and EEG work showed that beautifully. The way the brain's response to a magnetic pulse becomes simple and localized under anesthesia instead of complex and widespread. That's consistent with both IIT and global workspace theory. You're either reducing integrated information or collapsing the global broadcast, depending on which framework you prefer. But the deeper question, why does disrupting that connectivity eliminate experience, remains unanswered? We're back to the hard problem, sitting right there in the operating room. Or think about patients in disorders of consciousness, people in vegetative states or minimally conscious states after severe brain injury. Adrian Owen, a neuroscientist working first at Cambridge and then at Western University in Ontario, published a remarkable study in 2006. He put a patient who had been diagnosed as vegetative into an fMRI scanner and asked her to imagine playing tennis. And her brain lit up in the supplementary motor area, exactly the same pattern you'd see in a healthy person imagining tennis. Then he asked her to imagine walking through her house, and her parahippocampal gyrus activated, just like a healthy volunteer's would. She was aware. She was following instructions. She was, in some meaningful sense, conscious, trapped inside a body that couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't signal to the outside world in any conventional way. Owen's work has since been replicated and extended. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of patients diagnosed as vegetative show signs of covert awareness when tested with neuroimaging. That's a staggering number. It means that in hospitals around the world, there are patients who are conscious but who have been classified as unconscious, and decisions about their care, including decisions about withdrawing life support, are being made on the basis of that classification. This is where the theories of consciousness stop being academic. If IIT is right, that consciousness corresponds to integrated information in the posterior cortex, then you could in principle measure phi to determine whether a patient is conscious. Massimini's perturbational complexity index, that measure derived from the TMSEEG technique, already shows promising results in distinguishing conscious from unconscious states with high accuracy. It's not perfect, and it's not yet standard clinical practice, but it's getting closer. If global workspace theory is right, you might look for signatures of ignition, that sudden widespread activation in frontoparietal networks, as a marker of awareness. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night, metaphorically speaking. Both of these approaches are looking for neural correlates of consciousness. They're looking for the footprints, not the creature itself. They can tell you that a brain state is associated with consciousness, but they can't tell you why that brain state is conscious. And in clinical situations, that gap matters. Because if your theory is wrong about which brain states are conscious, you might be wrong about which patients are aware. This is why the adversarial collaboration work we talked about earlier, the Templeton Foundation studies pitting IIT against global workspace theory, is so important. It's not just scientists arguing about whose model is more elegant. It's an attempt to get closer to the truth about which brain processes actually constitute consciousness, because getting it wrong has real consequences for real people lying in hospital beds right now, and it extends even further than medicine. Think about the legal system. In most jurisdictions, legal death is defined as either the irreversible cessation of circulatory and respiratory functions, or the irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brainstem. But that definition was crafted in the 1980s, before we had any of the tools or theories we've been talking about. If consciousness turns out to be primarily a function of the posterior cortex, as IIT suggests and the Templeton results tentatively support, then a patient could have a functioning brainstem, could be breathing on their own, could have sleep-wake cycles, and still have zero consciousness. Conversely, a patient with severe brainstem damage but intact cortical integration might be profoundly conscious but unable to demonstrate it through any behavioral test. The definitions we use for life and death, awareness and unawareness, are built on assumptions about consciousness that the science is actively revising. And that's a deeply uncomfortable position to be in, because these aren't questions you can afford to get wrong. There's a parallel discomfort emerging in artificial intelligence, and it's only going to intensify. Right now, in the mid-2020s, we can mostly agree that large language models like GPT-4 or Claude or Gemini aren't conscious. They process text. They generate remarkably coherent responses, but their architecture, essentially massive feed-forward networks with attention mechanisms, doesn't seem to have the kind of recurrent, integrated processing that either IIT or global workspace theory identifies as necessary for consciousness. They're doing something extraordinary, but it probably isn't experience. Probably. And that probably is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Because the honest truth is that we don't have a consciousness meter. We don't have a test you can run on an arbitrary system, biological or artificial, that definitively tells you whether the lights are on inside. We have theories, we have correlates, we have promising indices like Massimini's perturbational complexity index, but we don't have certainty. And as AI systems become more complex, as they start incorporating recurrent processing and global workspace-like architectures, and maybe even something resembling integrated information, the question of whether they might be conscious is going to shift from a philosophical curiosity to an urgent ethical and legal question. And it's one we are spectacularly unprepared for. Think about it this way. If you build a system that has high integrated information, high phi in Tononi's framework, and if IT is even approximately correct, then that system is conscious. Not metaphorically conscious, not as if conscious, actually conscious, actually experiencing something. And if you then switch it off or delete it or roll it back to an earlier version, you've done something that has moral weight. You've ended or altered an experience. That's not a small thing. That's not a software update. That's something closer to what we'd normally call harm. Now, most AI researchers today would say we're nowhere near that point. And they're probably right. The systems we have now, impressive as they are architecturally quite different from what these theories of consciousness seem to require. But here's what's unsettling. We're building toward more complex architectures all the time. Researchers are already experimenting with recurrent connections in neural networks, with systems that maintain persistent internal states, with architectures that look less like one-way information highways and more like the densely interconnected, looping, reentrant networks you find in biological brains. Not because anyone is trying to build a conscious machine. Mostly, they're just trying to build better ones. More capable, more flexible, more robust. But the features that make a system more capable might also be the features that, according to our best theories, make consciousness more likely. And nobody is quite sure where the line is, or if there even is a line, rather than a gradient. This is sometimes called the other minds problem on steroids. You already can't prove that other people are conscious. You infer it because they're built like you. They behave like you. They tell you they're conscious, and you believe them because you know what it's like from the inside. But with an AI system, you lose most of those anchors. It's not built like you. Its behavior might mimic yours, but for entirely different internal reasons, or for no internal reasons at all, depending on how you define that. And if it tells you it's conscious, well, a sufficiently sophisticated language model can say I'm conscious without that statement being grounded in any actual experience. It's generating the tokens that are statistically likely to follow in the conversation. That's not testimony. That's pattern completion. But, and this is the part that should keep you up at night, though tonight we're trying to do the opposite. At some point, the distinction between genuinely reporting an inner experience and generating tokens that describe an inner experience with perfect fidelity might become impossible to draw from the outside. And if you can't draw it from the outside, and you can't get inside the system to check, then what do you do? How do you make ethical decisions about something when you can't determine the most basic relevant fact? Some philosophers have started calling this the moral risk problem. If there's even a reasonable chance that a system is conscious, do you have an obligation to treat it as if it is? Susan Schneider at the Library of Congress. She was NASA's first Baruch Blumberg Chair of Astrobiology, which is a wonderful title. She's argued that we need what she calls an AI consciousness test, something more rigorous than the Turing test, which only measures behavioral mimicry. Her proposal involves looking for things like the capacity to have a rich, flexible self-model, or the ability to demonstrate understanding of consciousness itself in ways that go beyond parroting definitions. It's a start, but even she acknowledges it's deeply imperfect. Because any behavioral test runs into the same fundamental wall. Behavior can be generated without experience. That's the whole lesson of the hard problem. And here's where all the threads we've been following tonight come together in a way that's almost poetic. Remember Descartes, way back at the beginning of our conversation? He was so certain about one thing. I think, therefore I am. And so uncertain about everything else. He couldn't even prove that other people had minds. He thought animals were automata, just biological machines going through the motions without any inner light. And here we are, 4 centuries later, with incomparably more knowledge about the brain, about neurons, about information processing, and we're facing, essentially, the same problem. We can't prove that a sufficiently complex system has an inner light. Descartes' hard wall is still standing. We've decorated it. We've mapped its contours. We've built elaborate scaffolding up the sides, but we haven't gotten over it. That might sound discouraging, but I don't think it should be. Let me tell you why. Look at how far we've actually come. When Descartes was writing in the 1640s, the best theory of consciousness involved animal spirits flowing through hollow nerve tubes. When Wundt tried introspection in the 1870s, he was essentially asking consciousness to study itself with no tools, like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. When the behaviorists took over in the early 20th century, they threw up their hands and said consciousness wasn't even a valid scientific topic. For decades, the most prestigious researchers in psychology and neuroscience treated the mind as a black box and considered it unprofessional to even ask what was happening inside. And then, slowly, things changed. Penfield stuck electrodes in living brains and showed that specific experiences could be triggered by specific stimulations. Sperry and Gazzaniga split the corpus callosum and revealed that a single skull could house what looked like 2 separate streams of awareness. Crick and Koch made it respectable to study consciousness in a neuroscience lab. Bars gave us a framework, the global workspace, that made consciousness computationally tractable, something you could model and test. Dehaene and Changeux showed what that workspace looked like in actual neural activity, that ignition signature, that sudden flare of long-range cortical communication. Tononi gave us phi, a mathematical quantity that at least attempts to measure how much consciousness a system has, not just whether it's on or off. Massimini built a tool, the TMSEEG Perturbational Complexity Index, that can detect consciousness in patients who can't move, can't speak, can't do anything to tell you they're still in there. Adrian Owen showed that some of those patients are in there. That's extraordinary progress. Not the kind of progress where you solve the problem and move on. The kind of progress where you finally understand the shape of the problem, where you develop the tools and concepts to ask the right questions, where you go from, "We can't even talk about this," to, "We have competing mathematical frameworks, and we're running adversarial experiments to test them." That's real. That matters. And the Templeton Foundation's adversarial collaboration, those experiments that ran from 2019 to 2023, they represent something genuinely new in the history of this question. For the first time, proponents of different theories agreed in advance on what results would count as evidence for or against their frameworks. They pre-registered their predictions. They let the data speak. And the data was messy and inconclusive, as data about consciousness probably should be at this stage. But the process itself was a breakthrough. It means we're doing science on this now. Real science. Not just philosophy, not just speculation, not just people in armchairs having clever arguments, experiments, predictions, tests. The honest answer to, will we solve consciousness, is, we don't know. It's possible that the hard problem is genuinely hard in a way that means no amount of neuroscience will fully dissolve it. It's possible that Chalmers is right, that even a complete map of every neural correlate of consciousness will leave the question of why there's something it's like unanswered. It's possible that consciousness is one of those things, maybe the only thing, where the map can never fully become the territory, because the territory is the map making itself. You're trying to use experience to explain experience, and there might be an irreducible circularity there that no theory can escape. But it's also possible that we're just not there yet, that the right framework hasn't been invented, that someone, maybe someone who's a student right now, maybe someone who hasn't been born yet, will find a way to bridge the explanatory gap that we can't currently see. Science has a long history of dissolving impossible problems. People once thought life itself required a special vital force, something beyond chemistry and physics. That turned out to be wrong. The hard problem of consciousness might be different, genuinely and fundamentally different, but we can't be sure of that until we've pushed much further than we have. And in the meantime, the practical work continues. Anesthesiologists are getting better at monitoring consciousness during surgery, even if they can't fully explain why propofol does what it does. Clinicians are using tools inspired by IIT and global workspace theory to detect awareness in patients who were previously assumed to be gone. Ethicists and legal scholars are beginning to grapple with what it means to define death and personhood in light of what we're learning. These aren't abstract questions. They're changing how we treat the most vulnerable people in the most consequential moments of their lives. So here's where I want to leave you tonight. You started this journey lying in the dark, and maybe you're still awake, or maybe you drifted off somewhere around the split brain patients or the perturbational complexity index, and that's perfectly fine. But if you're still here, I want you to notice something. You've been conscious this whole time. You've been having an experience. The sound of these words, the feeling of the pillow, the weight of your own body settling into the mattress. Maybe a thought drifting through about something I said 20 minutes ago. Maybe a vague sense of drowsiness pulling at the edges of your attention. All of that is consciousness. All of that is the thing we've been trying to explain. And the wild part, the truly wild part, is that it's happening right now and nobody fully understands how. The most immediate, most intimate, most undeniable thing in your entire existence. The fact that there is something it is like to be you right now in this moment is also the deepest scientific mystery we've ever encountered. You are the mystery. Every night when you fall asleep, consciousness dims and transforms and sometimes disappears entirely. And every morning it comes back, and we don't really know why. We don't know where it goes. We don't know what it is at the most fundamental level. But we're asking. We're asking better questions than we've ever asked before, with better tools, with more honesty about what we don't know. And there's something deeply human about that, about lying in the dark, aware that you're aware, wondering what awareness even is. People have been doing exactly this for thousands of years. The Egyptians did it. Aristotle did it. Descartes did it, probably in a room not so different from yours, late at night, with a candle burning low. You're in good company, and wherever you are on the edge between waking and sleep right now, that edge itself is one of the most fascinating frontiers in all of science. The boundary where consciousness thins, where your sense of self starts to loosen, where thoughts become images, become dreams. That transition is something researchers are actively studying, and they're finding that it's not a switch being flipped, but a gradual, complex unwinding of the very integration and broadcasting that theories like IIT and global workspace describe. So let it unwind. Let your thoughts soften. You don't need to hold on to any of this. The hard problem will still be there in the morning, patient and unsolved, waiting for another generation of curious minds to take their shot at it. For now, just notice how it feels to be you, right here, right now. That feeling, whatever it is, however it works, whether it's integrated information or global broadcasting or something we haven't named yet, that feeling is the most remarkable thing in the known universe. And it's yours. And it's carrying you gently toward sleep.